Here you go. A mistake she couldn't undo.
By the time I realized what was happening, the neighborhood had changed overnight. Roads were being controlled. Cars were being watched. Residents were being stopped and warned by someone with no badge, no uniform, just an HOA title and a hunger for control. She moved with the confidence of law enforcement, issuing threats that sounded official enough to scare people into silence. Cameras came out. Neighbors froze. And then she made one mistake that shattered the illusion completely. She decided to play police on the wrong property. And when real authority finally showed up, everything she built collapsed in public. How far can fake power go before it meets the real thing? Before any lines were crossed or authority was challenged, life in that neighborhood moved at a comfortable, predictable pace. The kind of place people chose specifically to avoid drama. Streets were clean, lawns trimmed, and routines respected without needing to be enforced. I lived there because it offered something rare, quiet without isolation. Neighbors recognized one another's cars, waved without obligation, and generally understood an unspoken rule: mind your business, and everyone gets along just fine. My days followed a steady rhythm. Early mornings. Consistent schedules. The kind of routine that makes a place feel earned rather than borrowed. The house wasn't flashy, but it was mine, paid for, maintained, and treated with care. I respected the community rules not because I feared consequences, but because order made life easier for everyone. Trash went out on time. Vehicles stayed where they belonged. Nothing excessive. Nothing provocative. Just normal living. The HOA existed mostly in the background, where it belonged. Emails about landscaping reminders. Occasional notices about shared spaces. Mild annoyances at worst. It was the kind of association people forgot about until they needed to complain about something trivial. Most residents complied without thinking twice, and I was no exception. There was never a reason to push back because there was never a reason to feel pushed. That balance worked, until it didn't. Changes rarely announce themselves loudly. They arrive subtly, wearing the disguise of concern or community standards. At first, it was small things. Extra notices on doors. More aggressive wording in emails. A shift in tone that felt less cooperative and more commanding. The HOA leadership had recently changed, and with it came a new energy. One that didn't feel like organization, but control. One individual stood out almost immediately. Not because of warmth or leadership, but because of presence. Always visible. Always watching. Always inserting herself where she wasn't needed. She carried herself with the certainty of someone who believed rules were weapons rather than guidelines. And she treated the neighborhood like a territory that required constant enforcement. Still, nothing had happened yet. No confrontation. No accusations. Just a growing sense that something was off. Neighbors began acting differently. Conversations ended quicker. People hesitated before pulling into their own driveways. Cars slowed unnecessarily, as if being observed. Cameras appeared in places they hadn't before. The community felt tighter, but not closer. Tense. Alert. As though everyone was waiting for the same unspoken problem to surface. I noticed it most in the mornings. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was watchful. Like a stage before a performance no one asked to see. And in that stillness, the HOA presence felt heavier, less administrative, more authoritative. It stopped feeling like a group managing shared interests and started feeling like someone playing a role they weren't qualified for. There were whispers. Residents comparing notes quietly. Someone mentioned being warned about parking. Another talked about being questioned near their own mailbox. Nothing officially documented. Nothing written down. Just intimidation wrapped in confident language and assumed power. I stayed out of it. Or at least I tried to. Experience teaches that attention often invites problems, and I had no interest in becoming a target. But avoiding attention doesn't guarantee safety when someone is actively looking for control. Especially when they believe compliance is owed rather than earned. The first sign that this wasn't going to stay subtle came without confrontation. No shouting. No threats. Just a shift so obvious it couldn't be ignored. Cones appeared where they hadn't before. Notices were posted in places that felt deliberately visible. The road itself, once neutral, once shared, suddenly felt claimed. It was strange how quickly normal became questionable. Where you could stand. Where you could park. When you could come and go without scrutiny. All things that had never been issues before were now being treated like violations waiting to happen. And through it all, that same figure lingered. Observing. Recording. Taking notes. Acting less like a neighbor and more like enforcement. The authority wasn't real, but the pressure was. What she didn't realize was that quiet neighborhoods don't mean defenseless ones. And pretending to hold power is dangerous when you don't understand the difference between rules and law. At that moment, none of us knew how far she was willing to go. We only knew something was coming. And whatever line she planned to cross, it was going to be very public. The shift from discomfort to confrontation didn't happen all at once. It unfolded through repetition, small intrusions stacking up until they felt deliberate. What began as watchful behavior slowly turned into action. The cones that appeared one morning weren't there by accident. They were placed with intention, arranged in a way that redirected traffic just enough to cause inconvenience without explanation. No notice had gone out. No meeting had been held. The road, which had always been shared and unremarkable, suddenly felt restricted. At first, I assumed it was temporary. Some kind of short-term maintenance issue that hadn't been communicated yet. But days passed, and nothing changed. Instead, more signs appeared. Laminated warnings posted at eye level. Language carefully chosen to sound official, vague enough to imply authority without citing it. Words like restricted, unauthorized, and subject to enforcement were used liberally, but never clearly defined. That was the first red flag. When rules are real, they're specific. They reference documents, sections, and processes. These didn't. They relied on confidence alone. The HOA emails followed shortly after. The tone was no longer polite or collaborative. It was assertive. Directive. Messages arrived early in the morning, late in the evening, time to be seen, not discussed. They referenced community complaints, without naming them. They cited ongoing investigations, without explaining what was being investigated. And each one ended with a subtle reminder that failure to comply could result in fines, towing, or further action. Still, nothing directly accused me. That changed when a notice appeared on my property. Not mailed. Not emailed. Physically placed. It referenced a violation that didn't exist, an alleged misuse of the roadway near my driveway. The language suggested repeated non-compliance, even though no prior warning had ever been issued. It was framed as a final notice before enforcement. I read it 3 times, trying to understand what rule I was supposed to have broken. There was no citation, no date, no photographic evidence. Just a claim, written confidently, daring me to challenge it. That was when frustration turned into something heavier. I reached out through the proper channels. Emails were sent asking for clarification. Requests were made for documentation. The responses, when they came at all, were dismissive, short, non-specific. Each reply redirected responsibility without answering questions. One message suggested that continued resistance could be interpreted as non-cooperation. Another implied that escalation would not be in my best interest. It wasn't about compliance anymore. It was about submission. The behavior outside escalated too. The same individual began showing up more frequently, standing near the road, observing vehicles, occasionally writing things down. She never spoke directly to me, but her presence was unmistakable. It was designed to be seen, to remind everyone that someone was watching. Neighbors started sharing experiences quietly. One had been told not to park near their own curb. Another mentioned being photographed while unloading groceries. A third had received a fine for a violation they didn't recognize. All of it traced back to the same source. The same pattern. Authority asserted without justification. The community atmosphere shifted dramatically. Where there had once been casual waves and easy routines, there was now hesitation. People lingered in their cars. They avoided eye contact. They complied instinctively, not because they believed the rules were valid, but because challenging them felt risky. And that was the point. Power doesn't need to be legitimate if it's intimidating enough. The fines came next. Not massive, but frequent. Small amounts designed to frustrate rather than bankrupt. Each one carried vague descriptions and tight deadlines. Appeals were technically allowed, but practically impossible. The process was buried in bureaucracy, routed through the same individuals issuing the penalties. There was no neutral oversight. No clear end. I contested every one. Not emotionally, methodically. I requested records. I asked for proof. I cited the HOA's own governing documents, pointing out inconsistencies and overreach. Each response I received grew colder, more hostile. It was clear the resistance wasn't expected. That resistance had consequences. The next notice accused me of interfering with HOA operations. The irony was staggering. Asking for documentation had been reframed as obstruction. Questioning authority had become a violation in itself. The language escalated from corrective to accusatory. It suggested intent. Motive. As if compliance wasn't enough, I was expected to accept the narrative without question. Meanwhile, the road situation worsened. The cones multiplied. Barriers appeared. At one point, access was partially blocked during peak hours. Residents were forced to detour or wait. Complaints were ignored. The explanation given was temporary regulation, though no timeline was provided. It started to resemble something else entirely. The HOA wasn't just enforcing rules. It was controlling movement. That realization unsettled more than just me. Neighbors began documenting interactions discreetly. Photos. Time stamps. Notes. Everyone sensed the same thing. This wasn't normal. And it wasn't sustainable. Then came the day she took it too far. I returned home to find my driveway partially obstructed, not fully blocked, but restricted enough to make a statement. A sign stood nearby warning against unauthorized access. The implication was clear. The message wasn't subtle. It was a challenge. I contacted the HOA again. This time, the response was immediate, firm, final. They claimed the action was within their authority and suggested further resistance would escalate enforcement. No mention of legality. No acknowledgement of property rights. Just assumption. That was the moment determination replaced frustration. I began documenting everything. Every sign. Every email. Every barrier. I reviewed property maps. Municipal regulations. Jurisdictional boundaries. The deeper I looked, the clearer it became. The HOA had no authority over that roadway. None. It wasn't private. It wasn't delegated. It wasn't even ambiguous. The confidence she displayed was built on nothing. Yet she continued. Her presence became more aggressive. She began directing residents verbally, gesturing, positioning herself where she could be seen by everyone passing through. At one point, she wore clothing that closely resembled official attire, dark colors, reflective elements, posture mimicking enforcement. It was performance masquerading as power, and people believed it. Until they didn't. The tension peaked when she attempted to document my vehicle as non-compliant, while it was parked entirely within my property. Cameras were visible. Neighbors watched. The silence was heavy. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was a test of how far she could go without being stopped. That was the cliff's edge. Because the next step wouldn't be a fine or a notice. It would be a call. And once that line was crossed, there would be no pretending left. The question wasn't whether real authority would get involved. It was how exposed she would be when it did. The moment everything broke open didn't arrive with shouting or chaos. It arrived with confidence, the wrong kind. By then, the neighborhood had already been conditioned to accept her presence as normal. Cones, signs, warnings, and silent intimidation had reshaped daily life so gradually that many residents barely remembered how things used to be. That was the real damage. Not the fines or the inconvenience, but the quiet surrender of normalcy. That morning, the road looked different again. More barriers, more signs, and her, standing where she had no right to stand, directing movement with practiced certainty. She wasn't hesitating anymore. She wasn't observing. She was enforcing. Cars slowed instinctively. Some stopped entirely. People complied without being told why. The illusion had matured into something dangerous. Assumed authority. And she fed it openly, positioning herself where everyone could see, making notes, lifting a phone as if documentation alone could create legitimacy. When she turned her attention toward my property again, it was no longer subtle. The implication was unmistakable. This was a final assertion of dominance, not just over me, but over the entire stretch of road. It was the peak of everything she had been building toward: control without consent, enforcement without jurisdiction. What she didn't realize was that every step she took that morning had already been recorded. Not just by me, but by neighbors who had reached their limit. Emails, notices, photographs, time-stamped video, property records, municipal maps. The evidence wasn't emotional. It was surgical. It told a single undeniable story. She had crossed from HOA overreach into impersonation, obstruction, and misuse of authority. And that distinction mattered. The call was made. Not dramatic. Not angry. Just factual. Clear. Precise. A report describing someone actively restricting a public roadway, directing traffic, issuing threats of enforcement, and presenting herself as an authority she was not. No exaggeration. No speculation. Just observable facts. When real authority arrived, the contrast was immediate. Vehicles stopped not because they were intimidated, but because procedure demanded it. Uniforms replaced clipboards. Questions replaced assumptions. The road, the signs, the cones, the notices, all of it was examined with a level of scrutiny she had never faced before. And suddenly, confidence wasn't enough. She attempted to explain, to justify, to frame her actions as community management. But the narrative collapsed under inspection. The jurisdiction didn't belong to her. The authority wasn't delegated. The enforcement mechanisms she relied on didn't exist. Each claim she had made so confidently unraveled in sequence, exposed not as misunderstanding, but as deliberate performance. Neighbors gathered, not aggressively, but attentively. Windows opened. Phones came out again, this time not in fear, but anticipation. The same people who had once avoided eye contact now watched openly as her authority dissolved in real time. The signs were removed. The cones were questioned. The road was confirmed as public. The HOA's reach was formally defined, and sharply limited. What had been implied for weeks was finally spoken through action. She had no power here. The most striking change wasn't her reaction. It was the neighborhood's. Compliance evaporated instantly. Cars moved freely. People walked without hesitation. The atmosphere shifted from tense to electric, charged with vindication. The spell had been broken, and everyone felt it at once. What had seemed unchallengeable moments earlier now looked fragile, even absurd. She was no longer directing traffic. She was being observed. And for the first time, she couldn't control the narrative. The HOA's involvement followed quickly. Statements were issued. Language softened. Responsibility blurred. What had once been framed as enforcement was now described as misunderstanding. Temporary measures became unauthorized actions. The confidence that had driven weeks of intimidation vanished overnight, replaced by silence and retreat. But the damage was already done. The exposure wasn't just public, it was permanent. Emails circulated. Evidence spread. Residents who had once stayed quiet now spoke openly. Questions were asked about leadership, about oversight, about how someone had been allowed to operate unchecked for so long. And the answer was uncomfortable. Because power like hers only exists when people believe it does. That realization hit harder than any fine or notice ever could. The community hadn't been controlled by rules. It had been controlled by fear, by uncertainty, by the assumption that someone else must know better. Once that illusion collapsed, there was nothing left to enforce. She disappeared from the road after that day. Not gradually. Immediately. The signs never returned. The cones were gone. Notices stopped appearing. Emails slowed, then stopped altogether. The silence that followed wasn't watchful anymore, it was relieved. But the story wasn't over. Because when false authority is exposed, accountability always follows. And what came next wouldn't just affect one person or one HOA, it would redefine the balance of power for everyone who lived there. The only question left was how far the consequences would reach. What followed the exposure wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was decisive. Power rarely collapses in a single moment. It dissolves. In the days after that morning, the neighborhood settled into a strange calm, as if everyone was recalibrating what normal was supposed to feel like again. The road stayed open. No cones returned. No signs reappeared overnight. The silence, once heavy with surveillance, became neutral again. Ordinary. The HOA, however, did not return to business as usual. Communication slowed to a crawl. Messages that once arrived with sharp deadlines and veiled threats were replaced with cautious, carefully worded updates. Where authority had once been asserted confidently, it was now hedged with disclaimers and references to clarification and review. Enforcement language vanished. Words like must and will were replaced with may and recommend. The shift wasn't subtle, it was defensive. Within weeks, a formal notice went out to all residents. It acknowledged that certain actions taken in recent months had exceeded the HOA's scope. Not by name. Not with an apology. But it didn't need to be explicit. Everyone knew exactly what it referred to. The document outlined revised boundaries of authority, clearly stating what the HOA could and could not do, particularly regarding public roadways, traffic direction, and resident movement. For the first time, the rules were actually specific. That alone was a victory. Meetings followed. Attendance spiked. People who had never bothered to log in or show up suddenly had questions, real ones. About oversight. About accountability. About how one person had been allowed to act unchecked for so long. The answers were uncomfortable. It became clear that much of the HOA's power had rested not on written authority, but on assumption. People had complied because challenging felt inconvenient, risky, or socially uncomfortable. That culture changed quickly once exposed. The individual at the center of it all never formally addressed the community. She didn't defend her actions publicly. She didn't explain. She simply withdrew. Her presence disappeared from shared spaces. Committees were reshuffled. Responsibilities reassigned. Eventually, her name stopped appearing on correspondence altogether. The absence spoke louder than any statement could have. In practical terms, the fines were rescinded. Notices voided. Records corrected. Residents who had paid penalties were credited or reimbursed quietly, without fanfare. The process was intentionally low profile, as if minimizing visibility might soften the embarrassment. But people noticed anyway. Trust, once cracked, doesn't repair invisibly. More importantly, boundaries were reestablished. Property rights were clarified. Jurisdictional lines respected. The HOA returned to its intended role: maintenance, coordination, communication, rather than control. The fear that had crept into daily routines evaporated, replaced by something sturdier: awareness. Neighbors changed, too. Conversations reopened. People lingered outside again. Cars parked without hesitation. The subtle anxiety that had made everyone cautious lifted, and with it came a renewed sense of community. Not because people suddenly agreed on everything, but because they understood something fundamental. Authority should never be assumed, and silence should never be mistaken for consent. Personally, the impact lingered longer. The experience left behind a sharpened understanding of how quickly normal life can be disrupted by unchecked power. It reinforced the importance of documentation, patience, and clarity. Emotional reactions might feel satisfying in the moment, but structure wins long-term. Facts, records, process. Those were the tools that ended the dispute, not confrontation. There was also a deeper lesson in restraint. It would have been easy to escalate earlier, to react publicly, to turn frustration into spectacle. But doing so would have fed the narrative she relied on, that enforcement was necessary because residents were unreasonable. Instead, the response stayed measured, strategic, grounded in legitimacy rather than volume. That approach didn't just resolve the issue, it exposed it. The broader consequence reached beyond the neighborhood. Residents began questioning other assumptions they had lived with unquestioned. What else had they accepted simply because it was presented confidently? What rules existed only because no one had ever asked where they came from? That mindset shift mattered. HOAs depend on participation, but they also depend on complacency. When residents disengage, power concentrates. When people stop asking questions, authority expands quietly. The events that unfolded served as a reminder that involvement isn't optional, it's protective. The story circulated, not as gossip, but as caution. Other communities nearby took notice. Meetings referenced it indirectly. Policies were reviewed. Training emphasized limits. No one wanted to be the next example of how quickly things could unravel. And that, perhaps, was the most satisfying outcome of all. Not embarrassment, not punishment, but correction. The neighborhood didn't win by overpowering someone who played police. It won by proving that real authority doesn't need to perform. It operates transparently, within limits, and accepts scrutiny. The moment someone resists that scrutiny is the moment they reveal they never had power to begin with. Life eventually returned to routine, the kind that feels earned again. Morning quiet without tension, evenings without observation. The road remained just a road, a shared space, not a checkpoint. Yet the memory stayed, not as anger, but as awareness. Because the real danger was never one person with a clipboard pretending to be something she wasn't. The real danger was how easily people believed her, how quickly fear replaced curiosity, and how long it took to challenge something that never should have existed. So the takeaway wasn't just about HOAs or neighborhood politics. It was about power itself, how it grows in silence, how it feeds on assumption, and how it collapses the moment someone asks the right questions and refuses to accept confidence as proof. If authority can't explain itself, it doesn't deserve compliance. And once a community learns that lesson, it never fully forgets it. The only question left is this: how many other rules, roles, and figures of authority exist around us right now, unchallenged, unquestioned, simply because no one has decided to look closely yet?